What's up, guys? Mr. Irvin here, and today we're going to be reviewing for the AP test, and we're going to be talking about period three, which is 1754 to 1800, titled The Birth of Our Nation. But in general, we're talking about period three, I want you to really kind of think about the American Revolution, because the American Revolution is what everything in this time period revolves around. So if we take a look at like the era that we're discussing here, this period is framed by 1754, which is the start of the French and Indian War, and it ends by 1800. And 1800 is when John Adams loses the election of 1800, and now you've got Jefferson coming in, and that's the start of Jeffersonian democracy, which is going to begin period four. So let's talk about what are the big stories that really shaped this time period. All right, so our first important story is the road to the revolution, which is all about the American Revolution and how it came to be. So the colonists were kind of used to having their independence and used to doing things on their own. But that starts to change in 1754 with the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War was a battle for North America that was fought primarily by the two great empires of the time, the French and their Indian allies, which is why the colonists called it the French and Indian War, and then the British, their colonists, and their Indian allies. And that war lasts until 1763. And the result of that war is that Great Britain wins, takes control of North America, but in the process, they rack up tons and tons of debt. So now they have this land, but they need to try to recoup some of the costs, and they also need to protect it. So that kind of changes the dynamic between Great Britain and its colonies. So right away, salutary neglect ends as the British government places new restrictions on the colonies. Immediately, colonists are banned from moving westward with the proclamation of 1763, and Great Britain starts to begin placing new taxes on the colonies in order to raise revenue. The best example of this is the Stamp Act, which was passed in 1765 and was the first direct tax on the colonies. The Stamp Act and then later the Townshend Acts, which was an indirect tax on certain colonial goods, became a major source of tension that was going to continually build towards the American Revolution. Now, this caused the American Revolution not only because it was an economic burden for some of the colonists, but because there were larger principles of self-government at stake. Many colonists found that the British taxes were oppressive because the colonists didn't have much say in the British government as a whole. Hence the very, very important and famous slogan, no taxation without representation. Of course, there were other issues that caused tensions between the colonists and Great Britain as well. One major issue was the increased military presence within the colonies following the French and Indian War. The British did not think the colonists were capable of protecting the lands that they had won from the war, and so there were a number of professional soldiers that remained in the colonies. Many colonists objected to housing these soldiers, and the Quartering Act, which was designed to, provide shelter for a lot of these soldiers who are now in the colonies, was a major source of tension. Additionally, conflicts broke out between colonists and soldiers in the form of the Boston Massacre, as well as the later battles of Lexington and Concord. Now, a third major cause of the American Revolution was the growth of Enlightenment ideals within the colonies. Even as tensions grew between Great Britain and the colonies, most Americans did not want independence. They still saw themselves as loyal British subjects. But as time goes on, many colonists are going to start to move away from reconciliation and are going to see more and more of these events, like the ones that are listed here, as violations of their natural rights. They were especially concerned over things like the Coercive Acts, which sought to punish Massachusetts following the Boston Tea Party. The suspension of Massachusetts legislature threatened colonial self-government. And so there's this shift away, like I said, from reconciliation towards more independence. And we see this becoming solidified by the publication of Common Sense by Thomas Paine in 1776. Now, in his pamphlet, Paine uses Enlightenment principles to argue that America was better off as an independent country. And we see by that summer, the Second Continental Congress officially commissioning the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration of Independence, which was signed in July of 1776, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, is going to leave no doubt that the colonists are seeking to form their own country. And he's also going to lay out some of those big grievances that the colonies have against Great Britain as a whole. So the fighting of the American Revolution, which began in 1775, actually prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, is going to continue all the way up to 1781 when the British are going to surrender at Yorktown. Now, you don't really need to know a lot about the individual battles of the war, but you should note that the colonists were divided over the American Revolution as a whole. Some of these colonists are going to become patriots and they're going to fight and die for independence. Some of them are going to remain loyalists and they're going to support the British throughout the course of the war. And then you've got a lot of people that are going to be staying on the sidelines, the people that are more moderate, that are just going to try to continue to live their lives. Now, in the end, the colonists will win the war, but not without the help of foreign countries, specifically the French, who are going to ally with them after the Battle of Saratoga. The end result of this is going to be the Treaty of Paris, which gave the colonists their independence and established the United States, whose borders are now going to stretch up to the Mississippi River. So the American Revolution is going to have many long-lasting effects on American history, and these are going to play out in our next two stories, which we're going to look at right now. So our second story is debates over federalism, and this story is essentially about the formation of a new government following the American Revolution. Even before the fighting of the American Revolution was over, it was clear that Americans wanted to create a republican form of government that would protect the rights of the people and give them more say in the government as a whole. However, what that would look like in practice kind of became a subject of great debate in the years after the fighting was over. Specifically, there was a lot of arguments over how much power should be concentrated in the central government versus the individual states. And that's what we're seeing kind of play out in this story. So the original government of the United States was known as the Articles of Confederation, which was written in 1777 while the American Revolution was still going on. Fearing the tyranny of the central government, the Articles of Confederation was intentionally very weak. And when I say that, I mean the federal government could pretty much do nothing. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could not tax, they could not maintain an army or navy, they could not regulate trade and disputes between states. I mean, the federal government didn't even have a federal judicial system. There wasn't a court system. Now, that's not to say that the Articles of Confederation were all bad. They did help to negotiate an end to the American Revolution in the form of the Treaty of Paris, and they did establish a system for organizing Western lands for statehood in the form of the Northwest Ordinance, which was passed in 1787. However, on the whole, the Articles of Confederation proved to be a system that gave very little power to the central government. And probably the best example of the weaknesses of this government came in the form of Shays' Rebellion, which was an uprising of farmers in western Massachusetts. With no military at their disposal, the federal government was unable to help end the rebellion, and the rebels who were participating in Shays' Rebellion almost succeeded in not only seizing weapons, but burning Boston to the ground. So the obvious weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation lead to calls for them to be amended. And the result was the Constitutional Convention, whose delegates decide to throw out the old government completely in favor of a new system that would give the federal government more power. Through a system of compromises, such as the Great Compromise, the Constitutional Convention helped produce the government that we have today, and one that was much more powerful than what came before it. The proposed government now contained an executive branch, a judiciary, as well as the power to tax and maintain an army. However, it is important to note that not all compromises were good. For example, the Constitutional Convention failed to address the issue of slavery, settling instead on the 3/5 compromise, which left slavery intact and counted slaves in the population of the United States as 3/5 of a person. Yet the framers of the Constitution felt that this new government, with its system of checks and balances, did a much better job of balancing power between the states and the federal government. The conclusion of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 led to one of the most significant political debates in American history. While a new constitution had been written by the framers at the convention, it had not become the new government and would not become the new government in the United States until 9 out of 13 states agreed to its ratification. The resulting debate divided Americans into two factions. On the one hand, you have the Federalists, who were Americans who favored the new government and felt that a stronger central government was necessary in order to prevent anarchy. On the other hand was the Anti-Federalists, who were Americans who didn't necessarily like the Articles of Confederation, but feared that the new government would be too powerful. Ultimately, the Constitution was ratified by 1789 with the help of the Federalist Papers, which were a series of essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay that made the case for the benefits and necessity of the new Constitution. The Federalists were also able to persuade many Americans to support the new system by promising to add a Bill of Rights, which would guarantee people protections against the federal government. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States, and the new government was established, which had way more power than the Articles of Confederation. This is best illustrated by the new government's response to the Whiskey Rebellion, which took place in 1794. Unlike Shays' Rebellion, George Washington was able to quickly raise an army and end the rebellion that was taking place in western Pennsylvania. Now, however, it's important to understand debates over the power of the central government are going to continue to persist even after 1789. Even within Washington's own cabinet, there was division over how to read the new Constitution. Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, believed that the Constitution should be interpreted loosely. And as a result, he saw no problem with the government doing things that were not directly mentioned in the Constitution itself. Most notably, Alexander Hamilton's financial plan sought to establish American credit by having the central government assume the debts of the states and establishing a Bank of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, who was Washington's Secretary of State, saw these policies as unconstitutional. To Jefferson, the Constitution should be read more strictly. Powers not mentioned in the Constitution were not allowed. By 1796, the disagreement between Hamilton and Jefferson had led to the creation of two distinct political parties, the first in our new nation's history. The Federalists followed Hamilton's views on the Constitution, while the Democratic Republicans became the party of Jefferson. These political divisions continued and deepened during the presidency of John Adams, who was elected after George Washington and saw himself as a Federalist. During his administration, the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, and they gave new authority to the central government and even made it illegal to speak out against the president. The Democratic Republicans responded to the Alien and Sedition Acts with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which would argue that the states had the power to nullify federal laws. The debates over federalism during this time period would lay the groundwork for continued tensions over states' rights, as well as other issues involving the power of the federal government that'll lead us all the way to the Civil War, and then obviously will cause tensions even beyond that. So our last story is debates over foreign policy. And with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, all of a sudden the United States was its own country capable of making its own foreign policy decisions. And what we have to understand is during this time period, our foreign policy was really kind of governed by two major ideas. The first was in response to the French Revolution, which broke out just as George Washington was becoming president. And the French Revolution divided Americans over whether or not we should get involved. After all, the United States had an alliance with France, which dated back to the American Revolution. And there was a lot of people, specifically Jefferson, who were calling for America to support France and saw the French Revolution as an extension of the American Revolution. However, there were others, most notably George Washington himself, who felt that the United States was not strong enough to get involved. And so the American foreign policy that becomes established during this time period is the policy of neutrality. Now, it's important to understand this is not isolationism. We are not trying to isolate ourselves from the world, but instead, George Washington sets America on a course of remaining kind of neutral in world events and kind of not getting involved in foreign alliances. We see this first with his proclamation of neutrality in 1793, and then his farewell address in 1796. Now, there's one other major kind of foreign policy initiative that we have to understand during this time period. And a lot of Americans' foreign policy also involved Native Americans. Native Americans had been left out of the Constitution, and they were viewed by the United States as a foreign entity. And so when dealing with Native Americans, especially in the Northwest Territory, the United States kind of view them as a foreign power on American soil. And so you see America engaging in fighting with those Native Americans for control over those Western lands. And that's going to result in the Treaty of Greenville, and then obviously continued conflicts that are going to take us into the next period as we get closer and closer to the War of 1812. So all of this is obviously part of our foreign policy, and this is only going to continue to grow as we get into Jefferson's presidency. So that's all we got for this one. Take care, guys.